Welcome to China EVs and More, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. We will open the room up at around the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions or make any comments. One rule, although we appreciate vigorous debate, let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I am the Managing Director at Sino Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.com, which of course, I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, sir. You're right. We're certainly no Jim Cramer. Good evening from cool and rainy Massachusetts. My name is Lei, and I am the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and the only tabloid magazine in English focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent the last 20 years on the ground in China covering the industry. I'm now in the U.S. as an independent analyst consultant, still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. This is episode 22, and Didi seems to be in a case of catch-22. So last week, they were at a high, and now they're at a low. How low can they go?
They were stars. They were stars last week.
Yeah. So this is one topic we're going to be discussing tonight. The other one is the self-driving startup AutoX, which launched their Generation 5 autonomous driving Robotaxi system, which Tu attended. And last but not least, we go into a little bit about the latest numbers in for June sales, and also Model Y is cutting prices again in China. So Tu, I think you've been in quite a few interviews this past couple of days, as well as on a call with the China-US series where the topic was Didi. And to give the audience a little bit of, the background for the Didi debacle. So on June 30th, it was the big IPO, right, in New York, raising about $4.4 billion. On July 1st, it was the CPC's 100th anniversary. And on July 2nd, the CAC, or the Cyber Administration of China, suddenly announces the cybersecurity investigation, asking Didi to suspend new user registration. 2 days later, it ordered Didi to remove its apps from the app stores, accusing it of illegally collecting user data. And a day later, another notice was issued for similar internet companies that recently listed in the U.S., Full Trucking Alliance, for example. So I know you probably seem to have beaten this Didi case to death, but simply what is the takeaway? What is the implication for the bigger picture? Not Didi, but the entire, the IPO space, tech companies. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
So I look at it like in the past, and one of the reasons I've partnered with the US-China series was to create more awareness. And I think that's exactly the same reason you and I are doing this podcast or this clubhouse room, is because it's such the mobility sector, what was the automotive sector turned into the transportation and now mobility sector. And we're talking private passenger vehicles, commercial passenger vehicles, or commercial vehicles. We're talking ride hailing. We're talking autonomous vehicles. So we cover it all. And it's so fascinating here what's happened in the last 10 or 12 years, right? But it's also evolving, and it's evolved into a smart EV sector. And that's where Didi comes in. And it's not just a Didi problem, it's a smart EV problem. Didi collects the same type of information that an Xpeng does, a Neo does, a Tesla does in their vehicles. So don't think of this as only affecting ride-hailing companies. It's going to affect autonomous vehicle companies. It's going to affect smart EV companies. And the fact of the matter is, I think the Chinese government has looked at what's happened with the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons in the United States, and what they've done in the EU as well. And I believe they've looked at it and said, okay, we can't let the technology giants from China, that's Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, and Didi for their vertical, become the dominant player and dictate to us or the market how the market should evolve. And so one of the areas that I think was a huge concern for them was the lack of transparency or understanding of where Didi moves its information to and from. And this is also, to your point, if we're not talking Didi, this becomes, and I've used your term Chinafornia quite a few times now because it's very appropriate in the mobility sector. So there's Pony, there is Too Simple, there is Plus, there is WeRide. Didi also has an office or two offices, multiple offices in Silicon Valley. And perhaps they were transferring information back and forth or data back and forth between the US and China. And that's a serious no-no to the Chinese government. And then not only that, but they were using hardware that I believe the Chinese government deemed to be vulnerable. If we think of the United States, they've kind of deemed Huawei as vulnerable as well, and have advised most of the U.S. technology companies not to use Huawei equipment. So I won't say it's a tit for tat, but I won't get too much into the politics, but that's kind of laying the foundation for what happened with this IPO. They were warned in so many words, the management, Didi's management, that they should hold off on this IPO because there's still some uncertainties that needed to be resolved before they were comfortable with Didi IPOing, but Didi went ahead and did it anyways. And then 2 days later, they dropped the hammer, right? And so people have asked me numerous times, especially specifically the folks that aren't in China, whether or not that I can use the app. I don't have any problems currently using the app over the last couple of days, and this might be a one-off. It's been a little bit harder to get a driver. It's taken a little bit longer. It's also rained here, so that could be the issue. But new users can't download the app either as a standalone or in the WeChat app. And so this really hamstrings them, right? There are a couple people, one person or two people that told me that they thought it was a hiccup, a speed bump. And I was like, no. I think it's actually pretty prudent to be cautious about this because we don't know where this is going, right? And as days go by, more and more information is revealed as to the behind the scenes. And so there's a lot of shares traded days prior to the IPO. So, I mean, there are some people in the know. And right now, the cat is out of the bag. And I don't know if you're going to convince investors that the management team didn't know something was up and should have disclosed it prior to the IPO. But, what are your thoughts on how do you think the agencies reacted and things like that?
Yeah, so this is going to drag on for months, not days or weeks. That's one. And today I just read that, the Chinese exercise app, Keep, right? You heard about it, as well as Himalaya.
Yep.
The Chinese podcast app, they all scrapped their US IPOs. These are sort of the apps that collect tons of user data, right? And going back to Didi, what I thought was interesting, the whole IPO, the timing of it, the low-key nature of it, right? IPOing on June 30th, maybe the day before the CPC's 100th anniversary, maybe that's one of the reasons why it was so low key, right? This is
Yes,
a
for sure.
such big event for IPO, and you don't see their, social media channels, Weibo, WeChat, nothing was announced, right?
Hmm.
It could have been because of the CPC anniversary, or something was already going on behind the scenes. The kind of the
To quickly piggyback off of your comments there, they also didn't push for a high valuation, right? Because rumors before the actual IPO announcement was that they were pushing for 100, or Chengwei was pushing for $100 billion valuation. And, my moles were telling me that, yeah, normally when you hear about these valuations, the entrepreneurs and investors are pushing for these early investors are pushing for these high valuations, right? But I didn't see that or hear that. And so that was also kind of strange as well. So please continue.
Yeah, so in the meantime, remember in our last episode, I sort of mentioned that Didi has become this monopolistic, state-owned taxi company
Right.
because, right, it's I mean, after, taking over Uber in 2016, and then, a couple of years before that, merging Kuaidi, it's the biggest ride-hailing platform, right?
They're a digital taxi company,
Yeah, so
right?
by the end of 2020, I hope I got this number right. Their daily average order was over 560 million. I'm not sure if that's the right number, but it's
Yes.
a humongous number. And to compare the competition, the next three biggest ride-hailing platforms, Geely's Cao Cao Mobility, 16 million, T3, 15 million. Meituan and Shouqi, they're in a million level. So that's a huge discrepancy, right? So
That's the thing. There's significant numbers. These competitors have significant numbers, but they're like rounding
yeah,
errors when you compare them to Didi's numbers, right?
so they're the biggest one. Even if their apps are taken off the stores, right? There's already hundreds of millions of users using it already. I mean, they're not affected. So I think one way to look at this, I'm no expert on the the regulatory uh,
Right.
uh, behind it, but in terms of competition, this is a great opportunity for these other ones. Expect a lot of discounts. Expect a lot of you know
Oh man,
coupons, right?
it's
What do
gonna
you
be
call it in
brutal.
China?
It's gonna be
To
brutal.
drive user growth,
Oh,
right?
how true?
Yeah,
Benefits essentially.
yeah, and from the China Information Network Center, I think this is number by the end of March 2020. Uh, so there's about 400 million ride-hailing users, about 40% of the entire internet user base, and there's over 140 platforms with authorization to carry out ride-hailing services. And then you count the drivers, right, on all these platforms, the daily orders. So I think for this period on, these these competitors, they're gonna be on the move. So
Yeah. Oh,
yeah, and,
especially if
right.
right.
So also another way to look at this is the CA that China announced this internet. I don't remember the exact term, but sort of the internet law, right? That was announced in June of last year, I
Right.
believe. And
Yes.
CAC is huge, but there is this subdivision under CAC called the China Cyber Security Investigation Office, and this DD debacle is actually the very first case that was looked into by this office. So what I'm thinking is where this thing is going is that China seems to be taking a proactive stance when it comes to maybe not so much privacy, but in terms of, the whole data collection. And in some ways, I think China wants to be ahead of Europe. Europe has the most stringent, right, privacy rules in the world,
Right.
even more than the US. And it seems like China is trying to move ahead on that front. And if you think about it, and you live in China, I live in China, there's no privacy, pretty much. I mean, people want convenience. You sign up for something, you scan something, you scan the QR code, and your information is probably already, out there. Things like that, right?
I think the difference is you see Facebook's kind of disclosures and mistakes in the past. So I think that's an easy example. And that's also why I believe Apple, not only because out of serious concern, because there's always a profit motive with all these companies, but there was a serious concern about the privacy. And that's why Apple kind of, the pendulum swung and said, we're going to let you opt out of these as you download each new app. And that's when Google and Facebook and those guys got really upset, right? So, and so the pendulum could be swinging.
And so far, the CEO and the president of Didi have been, quiet. They haven't said anything.
Oh, so quiet.
Almost you feel like you're going back to when that Ant thing, right? Ant Financial, and Jack Ma has been quiet ever since then, right? So we're waiting. Well, Didi issued an official statement, but I mean that's that.
Yeah, of course they are. So let me just put a bow on this. Didi opened at 14. It got up to 16.58. It's trading at 11 and change today.
High was 18.
So they've lost a ton of value. 18. Oh, wow. Okay. So I missed out on that. But there's a U.S. senator that said the SEC should look into this to find out who knew what, when.
I'm pretty sure lawsuits are coming.
Oh, without question. I mean, that's what happens when you access U.S. capital markets, right? If something bad happens.
Amid all the brouhaha, you see Xpeng being listed on the HK, right?
Yep.
That was interesting, I thought. Putting Didi aside, I think this is what we're going to be watching is just what China is going to do when it comes to, the regulatory oversight, data collection. And, Professor X, the founder of AutoX, he mentioned something in one of the podcasts I heard, is that the regulations in autonomous driving is far behind what these AV companies has been demonstrating. And in a similar way, innovations are happening fast. Regulatory oversight is behind, regulations are behind. What are the right framework, to put into place? These are all missing. So, the Chinese saying is 摸着石头过河. So you feel the stone when you cross the river. I guess that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, so you and I agree that this is a multiple month thing. Didi's not out of the woods after a couple weeks. And there was a gentleman, his name is Robert Goris, who posted on LinkedIn. He happened to be a participant or sit in on a Zoom call that I had with Paul to talk about what's going on with Didi. And he posted, and I'll read what he summarized that I said. The U.S. lost control over big tech. So this is China protecting itself from big tech. China is risky for foreign investors. You should price in that risk when you're evaluating investments. This won't stop at Didi. To your point just now with Professor X and AutoX, the policy and regulations need to also catch up with autonomous vehicles. And ultimately, what smart EVs will want to become are autonomous vehicles. So you can bet that's going to affect the future of EVs and AVs, not only here, but there's going to be a reaction as well from the EU and the United States. Maybe it's a spark that gets them off of their butts a little bit because, this was a Chinese company that listed in the US, but doesn't really have that much business in the EU or the US, right? But when Xpeng goes to Norway or Germany, NIO goes to Germany, they go to the United States in 4 or 5 years. will there also be stringent requirements from them, from the US government, from the EU government, regarding how they manage data, right? I would assume so. That hasn't been communicated and clearly strategized yet by those regions or those countries. And finally, with regards to Didi, it's going to be difficult to convince investors that the management didn't know beforehand that this hammer was going to be dropped. It's just super interesting. And I also agree with you that this opens the door to many, many competitors. And I think you and I believe that most of these OEMs, once they're onto their second or third EV product launch, they'll also look at ride-hailing opportunities, either via partnership. So Didi, of all people, they've partnered with BYD and GAC to build a ride-hailing car. So I could see tons of other OEMs. You've mentioned Taotao. Chang'an has their own ride-hailing service. GAC, I think, has their own ride-hailing service. So the competition is only going to increase, and their domination will still be felt in the tier 1 cities, but it's these tier 2 through 4 or 5 where the battle lines are going to get drawn by the competitors, right? And now that Didi is a publicly traded company, they're going to have pressure to increase the TAM, or the total addressable market, right? That's the only way they're going to increase their share price or their market cap. There's going to be a lot of pressure on them to do that with no new users being able to download the app. That's going to be pretty difficult, right? So maybe, Lei, we can move on to some of these June numbers for sales, unless you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is in China, there's so many regulatory bodies. There are a lot of peculiarities behind that, right? We talked about the Tesla recall last episode. That was from the State Administration of Market Regulation. And when you read that State Administration of Market Regulation, shouldn't it be doing some of the similar things in regulating Didi? And then you have the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is, probably will override SAMR. And then you also have, the Ministry of Transport, which look at certain things in the transport sector, and as well as MIIT, NDRC, all of these that even, having... That's
why I rely on you
even
to help me.
Having lived in China for so many years, you still have these mix-up on who's responsible to regulate what. That's the sort of peculiarity in China.
Well, to be fair, though, on these normal regulatory bodies, whether they're in the EU, the US, or China, the business and the landscape of regulation has changed, and we see a lot of overlap or regulations needing to be blended, and I think there's a lot of gray area, right? Is this your responsibility? Is this my responsibility? Because although they sell cars, they also collect a lot of data, like a vacuum cleaner, right? And so I think part of that is going to be who has the veto power, right? Who has ultimate say. And I think that's easier in China to determine than it is in the EU, or it would be in the United States. But I do also see a maturing, or at least a discovery and a discussion of, to your point earlier, frameworks as to how to manage data privacy, national security on the hardware and on the software and on the data side. So there's multiple dimensions for the consumer data privacy, national security. There's hardware, there's software, and there's this data that comes from it, right? Because all this stuff alone is dangerous, but put together and then analyzed, it creates insights, right? It creates insights to commercialize. It also creates insights to national security stuff. So we won't get into that, but this is going to be evolving, and Didi just really, really pulled everything to the forefront. So I think we're going to see much more thought put into this globally.
The type of equipment, the type of hardware that you use on collecting these data will also be scrutinized, right? I think that was from one of the, right?
Without question.
So, it could be from all angles.
Because Didi could literally have to just rip out their entire IT infrastructure and start over. That's the worst case scenario, obviously, because and it could be innocuous, right? They could have Dell servers, they could have HP servers, but the Chinese government wants X, Y, and Z to happen, right? There could be cloud services that they use that have ties to certain countries that they're not comfortable with. So this is not an easy solution. There's not an easy solution here because obviously there was enough red flags that this happened, right? And so there's a lot of vulnerabilities that Didi needs to remedy in order to get back into the good graces of the Chinese government. And one last thing I'll say, I think it's a bad take to say that the Chinese government doesn't care about having global brands. It obviously does. And them doing this, to me, it indicates that, you know what, we do still care about global brands, but we're going to do it our way. And I think it's a bad take to say they don't care about having global brands. Of course they do. But they don't want the West dictating to them, this is how a global brand is defined or how they get to become a global brand, right? So anyways, that's enough talk about that. Let's get to these numbers. I know Tesla just came out with their June numbers. So can you talk to us about that?
Well, it was two bombs on the same day, right? Tesla numbers came out, which was not surprising at all. We talked about this. They're doing over 30,000 units. I think 5,000 were exported. And on the same day, they announced the standard range rear-wheel drive using the FP battery at 276,000 renminbi, which is just around $40,000 if you do the math, right?
Yes.
A little bit over $40,000, which is, I think, cheaper than what it sells here, right?
Yes, it is.
I feel like it's cheaper. I could be wrong, but so I mean the entire.
I think it's closer to 50 in the U.S.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's closer to 50 in the U.S.
I think they just raised prices here for the Model S and X today. I mean, they've been raising prices here almost every other week, and in China it's just coming out. Another. Don't be surprised, another cheaper Tesla. So the narrative, right? Remember back 3 months ago, has completely changed. They seem to be doing fine, and the whole June, I felt like it was not surprising at all. I think overall, auto sales or car sales are down a bit year on year and month on month. But
I think 5% in June.
Yeah.
Down, like overall car sales are down 5%.
NEVs. I'm looking at some of these numbers and extrapolating a bit. The CPCA numbers are a little bit around 227, so almost 230,000 units new energy passenger vehicles. And I'm expecting when the CAAM announce their numbers, if not today, your time, then probably by Monday, I expect the number to be over 250,000 units for June, and roughly accounting for 13% of auto sales, which is all-time high.
Yes.
I don't know.
250,000 units, that's 2/3 of the way to the United States last year's total for 2020, because the United States bought about 358,000 units total,
right. And
with Tesla owning that share, right?
There's no better place to go for numbers than the Ministry of Public Security, which announced the first half, vehicle park, how many vehicles on the roads numbers earlier this week.
Mm-hmm.
So the NEV, the new energy vehicle registration in the first half of this year were over 1.1 million units. And to compare, last year China sold 1.36 million NEVs. So it's almost already at last year's level in 6 months.
Yes.
So, right, and according to their numbers, registration were 637,000 units in Q2. And in Q1, it was 466,000. And look at that jump, right? Almost a 200,000 unit jump.
Yeah.
So extrapolating a little bit, I'm thinking it's probably around 1.2 million units sales in the first half. And, the ones that we've been talking about, Tesla, BYD, Hongguang Mini EV, they're going to be up there in terms of,
Yes.
taking the most
Hundreds
majority
of
of the
thousands.
share, right? I think BYD was over 40,000. So, part of the reason behind this, remember, is the pressure on the NEV credit, produce and sell.
Yes.
If you don't produce, you buy credits from Tesla, for example. Right?
Or BYD.
So all the car makers are pressured to do this. That's why I was confident to say, and I'm now going to say my 2.5 million units is going to be very conservative for the year.
Oh, man.
Just based on, the historical, cyclical, seasonal trends that I've been seeing over the years. Second half is always going to be higher than the first half, right? The chip shortage is in the rearview mirror. More models coming
The other
online.
thing, too. Yeah, that's what I wanted to mention, right? If I am an OEM or an EV maker that has promised in Q3 or early Q4 of starting delivery of a new product, I am working my butt off. My team is working their butt off to make sure that we launch on time and do not miss this opportunity at this growth spurt in China to get some share for our new product. Because with all this good news, you would think that the usual suspects lay, and we talked about this last week, so I won't dwell on this, but the legacies aren't really participating in this huge increase in NEV sales in China. And it's a lot of China domestics and EV startups that are really taking advantage of this increase. And so, I'm looking at the Mach-E, I'm looking at the Model Y completely ramping before the end of summer. And they're going to be able to make it, in my humble opinion, they're going to be able to sell everything they make. So,
well, the Model E is really feeling it.
Or the Mach-E.
The Mach-E is really feeling it from the latest Model Y, I'm telling you. Ford is going to be pissed.
But you don't think this is going to be you don't think this could be like a two-man race? Do you think the ID.6 will come in anywhere with significant share or impact?
When the Mach-E, the locally Mach-E was announced right before Auto Shanghai, it was huge. I think it was, the consumer or the public response was great. I think that they got a lot of orders.
Yep.
In some way,
right.
In some ways, it's even better known than Ford in China.
Yeah, you would know that more than I would. So.
Right, but the deliveries don't start until Q3 or Q4.
Yes.
And Tesla is known for just undercutting at the most appropriate time, right? They keep doing.
Oh, yeah.
So
we might as well talk about that ET7, how NIO announced that, and I read this, but you said the number's not right. They said that they could get up to 70,000 unit sales for the ET7 in 2022, which to me is a huge number for a $70,000 sedan. That means that they're taking share from the ABB. They're taking share from Audi, BMW, and Benz and Mercedes-Benz. But also, that does not bode well for the Model S. Although the Model S is imported and probably doesn't sell more than a few thousand units a month here, or at the most, it's still a vehicle that sells because of its high price. And so I just think that if they're selling 70,000 units in first year, man, there's going to be a lot of disappointed premium sedan makers in 2022. So what was your take on that announcement?
The 70,000, I don't think that was announced by NIO. I think that was a prediction by one of the securities firms.
Okay, right.
I don't think
right.
I don't think NIO would announce these sort of targets, sales targets, right?
Right.
But
sure. Okay.
What I'm saying is,
that's
forget
my
about
mistake.
ET7. First thing, get to 10,000 per month deliveries. That's a huge psychological step
Yes.
and a milestone if they can get there. I think they're pretty close, and I think they will because they got 8,000 in June, more than 8,000 in June. And
Right.
recently, the way they've stepped up their swap stations, right, was pretty significant. I mean, adding like a couple of dozen in, within a week or something.
They must have the process of putting those in place down so fast. It must be a matter of days kind of thing, right?
And, speaking of
Where
the
it's like,
competition,
I find a spot.
yeah. Speaking of the competition, especially the German brands, whether it's Volkswagen or whether it's the luxury brands, they just, right, they haven't gotten their game right. Virtually, it's been a failure. I mean, I always am so nice, when commenting. I mean, you're
yes,
very
that's
harsh.
bold. That's a bold statement. Oh man,
No,
for you to say that,
no.
that's meaningful.
I mean,
That's actually meaningful.
hey, Volkswagen admitted. This is, someone I've spoken to, Volkswagen China, that they got their ID4 marketing wrong. ID4 is supposed to, cater to the family crowd, not to the young. Because when you cater to the young people, the young generation, they're going to be looking at features that the ID4 just don't provide, right? Whether it's
Well, you better
that,
come strong with that stuff, right?
whether it's,
Connected.
how you flip the screens, how fast, right? The touch screens when you swipe, things like that. They're going to be demanding that. So I think they admitted that was wrong, and headquarters will be like, "Hey, ID4 is selling like hotcakes in Europe. Why are you not doing well in China?" Well, that's what they're facing now. And the ID6, right? They just came out with the ID6. Now the Model Y undercuts the ID6 even at that price point.
But even at a higher level, Lei, and please debate me if you think that this is not an accurate statement. For the first 30 years they've been doing business here, 35 years of doing business here, they haven't really had that much competition. I think the VW branding really did a lot of the selling for them. Right?
Yeah. And here's the flip side of it. And I'm returning after saying that it's a failure. Now I'm gonna be a fanboy again. Look at we're talking about sales. Mercedes, BMW, they announced their sales numbers in China for the first half. And they're going to be closing in on selling 1 million units. So let's forget about EVs for a second. I mean, that's just unheard of, right? Being able to sell that many vehicles in China. So that's why I say whenever you see these comparisons of Model Y sales with ID4, with ID6, with EQC, with iX3, sometimes I don't think it's fair, right? I don't know how to explain it, but sometimes I don't feel like it's apples to apples comparison.
But that's also because we live in this space, right?
Right. So
so we can kind of.
So sometimes I want to cut these brands a slack, but at the same time, yes, it's been a failure so far.
Yeah, and remember that this is actually even more impressive when you put on top the fact that the overall market is shrinking, right? So ABB is growing share. I think Cadillac's also growing sales in a overall market that's shrinking. Okay, so that makes it even more impressive. But so that's the internal conflict, Lei, because they are seeing the sales bump, but not on their future, on their past. Okay, and they still need their past to fund their future. And so there's this dichotomy. There has to be factions within the management teams that say EVs won't be mainstream until X, 2020 X, right? And so we still need strong sales of ICEs for the next X years. But to your point earlier about 2.5 million units being conservative for NEVs in China, their argument is getting all blown up now, right? Because what they thought was a 3 or 4 year runway, 5-year runway, has now become a 2-3 year runway. And if they're not reevaluating features, marketing, product planning, pulling in, eliminating, and simplifying their product portfolio, pushing forward more hybrids, more EVs, they're going to miss out in China, and they're not going to be able to get that market share back, because you know and I know that these domestic guys and these China EV startups, if they get to 15, 16% market share, 8, 9, 10%, they're not going to give that up very easily. And so if they lose it, if these legacies lose that market share, I think it's going to be really difficult for them to get it back.
Yeah. And for these German luxury brands, what they're facing, the difficult situation where they're facing in China is the definition of luxury has totally been redefined by these startups.
Or evolved.
Right. They're coming from actually a, lagging position, even though they are luxury brands in the traditional sense. So this is tough. I mean, it's
yeah, simply put, luxury and premium is now services, right? As opposed to, fine leather and amazing interiors that are luxurious and, with high quality materials and well designed and thought out buttons, knobs. And so where premium and luxury now for the digital native, the Chinese digital native, is going to be seamless integration with my mobile phone, seamless integration with my social media app. I mean, that's important to those guys, right?
Yeah.
And the ID4 can't do that, to your point. And luxury is going to be an extension of that, but it's going to be the premium services, right, that are offered, maybe even when you're not in the vehicle, right? That'll be associated with the brand still, but has nothing to do with the car physically. And so they're kind of at a loss now, I think.
These brands
and so this is the coolest part of it.
They are at an unenviable situation of, okay, we still have the demand. We're going to be selling 1 million units this year, but we have to buy credits from someone else because our EVs are not selling well. They're going to be confronted with this situation for quite some time to come. So, yeah.
And then not only that, but remember that they have all this capacity as well. Mm-hmm. So they're going to have to turn it over at some point in time. And that means that they need to draw a line in the sand in the future to say that at a certain point in time, I need to focus more on EVs, regardless of whether or not my sales keep on increasing for ICEs, right?
Yeah, and it was interesting to see that Oppo will be returning to China as a electric brand. That this was announced by the Stellantis,
right?
Today. I thought that was interesting.
They're writing a big check, right? Tavares said he's writing a big check, right?
Yeah, well, he's writing a big check, but he's saying, we got to stop the red ink in China first.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is they find that it's easier to recycle an established brand. And you tell me, maybe you can educate us for 30 seconds. Has Opel ever been here, and why did it leave? Because you would think that, okay, I will invest in a current brand and transform it into an EV, but they think it's easier to bring a brand back or launch a current brand in China. So can you tell us a little bit about Opel in China?
Opel is,
if there's a history,
it was huge in China. I mean, I think this is not
as a GM brand,
right?
As a GM brand,
right? As a GM brand, and they're returning as a electric brand will mark, I think, their second return to China, if I'm not mistaken, because at the very beginning, Opel provided the engineering for, the Opel, what was the model name, was behind some of the
Buicks?
Right, the Buick Sail, the 100,000 RMB family car that GM launched in 2000, a little bit before 2000, 1999. But Opel was sort of this, German imported brand that never caught on. There were talk about localizing production, but they just didn't. The volumes, the network just didn't work out in China, so they backed out.
Now that you mention that, I do remember Opel being here.
Yeah.
And I think
some of their
lack of success in China was
popular.
Yeah, I blame the lack of success for Opel being a GM problem, not an Opel problem. So
yeah,
and I'm gonna read up a little bit more on the Stellantis details because I'm very interested. My brother works in Auburn Hills, so he's gonna be affected in some way. And then I have some friends that work at Jeep here, so I want to get their take So maybe we can talk about that a little bit next week. But we are at 9:25, Lei.
Did you still?
So we went through Didi.
Right. Did you still want to talk
Go ahead.
about AutoX a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I mean, you're going to be doing the heavy hitting. You were at the event, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so we didn't get to ride the Gen 5 EV. It was just more or less an hour and a half of going over the details of the vehicle and more or less their philosophy. And I had not been to an AutoX event live myself yet, so I didn't have any preconceived notions or expectations at a high level. So for those that are wondering, I was in Shanghai earlier this week for a couple meetings and an AutoX launch event for their Gen 5 Robotaxi. So if you guys can recall, if you can recall, a few weeks ago I had visited Baidu's Apollo and had a look at their Gen 5. Their Gen 5 Robotaxi was still a pilot. I believe now Apollo has the production versions and are probably starting to roll those out. But AutoX's Robotaxi, there's 50 sensors, 28 cameras, and they're using a Chrysler Pacifica as their vehicle of choice. So a couple peculiar things with the choice of the Pacifica. Number one, it's a minivan. Number two, it's an ICE or a hybrid. So I would think that was a little bit of a head scratcher as to why they haven't transitioned over to an electric vehicle platform, since that's the future. The other part of it too is most of these other companies, I won't say most, some of these other companies, Baidu, Pony, they've announced partnerships with OEMs to use their vehicles to become the robotaxis. And AutoX, I don't think they've done that yet. So I'm wondering why that's not happened. Have they not been able to find a suitable partner, a suitable OEM, or are they choosing to try to stay agnostic for now? Because there has to be some willing partners among the Chinese domestic brands, number one, and then number two, some of the foreign OEMs. And I can't help but think, and this has nothing to do with the launch event, but I can't help but think, as Didi was happening in the background, how the Didi issue could affect AutoX, their IPO, their aspirations, their back-end IT infrastructure and strategy. Right? Because they also have pilot programs in the United States, and they're a Chinese company as well. So that's two things that are very similar to Didi, but they're obviously not a $60 billion company yet. So I think there is, but to your point about Himalaya and a couple of these other companies that trash their IPO plans, I would bet that the banks that AutoX is talking to and some of these other AV companies that has aspirations to IPO or were curious about IPOing in the United States, they definitely reevaluating that. And when I sit in these launch events and they're in Chinese, admittedly, I'll understand about 70% of what they're saying, because there's still a lot of terms, technical terms, that I just don't still understand very well. And they talk really fast, or in my opinion. So it's hard for me to keep up. But so I don't have all the details of the vehicle, although I do know that they leaned into the computer that's running the machine learning system that is supposed to be the fastest 2200 tops in the market currently, right? But I don't see that being a differentiating factor for very long. If we've seen anything, an example would be the smart parking feature that XPeng had rolled out a month and a half ago. Right on the heels of that, you saw Baidu with their smart parking feature. You saw Hengchi with their smart parking feature. So this is going to be an arms race between computing power, sensors, radar, cameras, and LiDAR. But there was a good point that, I was having a discussion with a couple other folks that attended the event. And this is a rhetorical question because I don't know the answer but if someone does have good perspective, and Lei, you tell me as well. I'd love your input if you have an opinion. What is the right number of sensors? 50 sounds like a ton, right? And when you think about Baidu's Apollo launch Gen 5, where they said their vehicle is a $500,000 RMB, which the equivalent of about 75, 80,000 US dollars, that's cheap. 50 sensors and the computing power necessary to analyze, to pull that data, analyze that data, and then make decisions in split seconds, that has to be expensive. And so I don't think AutoX's Gen 5 hardware software stack plus a car is going to touch that 75,000 US dollars. But the food for thought that I was given was, if they overemphasize the number of sensors, does that mean their algo or their machine learning system isn't as robust, perhaps, as some of these other Robotaxi companies? Because I don't know what the right number is, but 50 sounds like a lot. 28 cameras, and they're, it's an impressive setup, super impressive setup. So I'm not taking away anything from that, but is it a philosophical difference, or is it a quality issue, or a quality difference between the systems that are being used? I don't know yet. I don't think anybody can definitively tell you yet, because there's a lot of different trains of thought. So I know you also watched the video. What did you take away, or what were your top 3 or 4 moments where you're like, that was pretty interesting that he said that? Or Professor X is the CEO founder of AutoX, and he's the one that did the presentation. So what are your thoughts, Lei?
Yeah, so AutoX is only 5 years old. It was founded in 2016 by Professor X. I felt like he was speaking very fast. He was very geeky
So it wasn't
in a
just me.
way,
So it wasn't just
and
me.
no, and he's definitely a stacker. And what I mean by that is the sheer number of sensors he's putting on this Gen 5
Mm-hmm.
Pacifica. And by the way, he mentioned this, using the Pacifica. Part of the reason is the drive-by-wire collaboration. I think
Yeah.
they're working with Chrysler is
Yes.
better for what they're doing. And also, by the way,
Yep.
one of their A-round investors back in 2017 is Dongfeng. So they do have a OEM in the back as an investor. But what I thought was just putting all these sensors, right? The 28 8 megapixel cameras. I don't know whether all 28 of them are 8 megapixel, but the 8 megapixel, and then the two 128 beam lidars on the top, and then the four corners 64 beam lidars. So it's a total of 6 lidars. Okay. So you can do the math about the cost. And he sort of mentioned it. He said, it's roughly 2 cars. So you're buying a Pacifica and you're putting another Pacifica on top as the suite, right? Including the computing. At least that's what I take it to mean, when he said that. But
Right.
he actually answered the question why he's putting so many sensors on the vehicle. He said this, and at the very end, which basically, if I have to put one more sensor, I will, and that's because I want it to be safe. It's all about safety.
Mm.
That was sort of his answer, and his Gen 5 system is capable of putting, I think, 10 lidars, 1040 radars. So I mean, he just throws all these crazy numbers up there, but the fact is, they've been running as a pilot program in the Pingshan district, where I think BYD is based in
Yeah.
Shenzhen, their headquarters, for half a year now. And obviously, I think they are the Waymo of China. You know, not only because they're also using Pacifica, but in terms of launching that type of service. And also, they're one of the first, I think only one of five to get California's full driverless testing permit.
Is it 5 now?
Uh, yeah,
I,
five or six, I think. The other one, I think, was WeRide and Pony, maybe. You know, one
yep.
of these China formula companies.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, other than that, I think he's just saying, you know, we, in terms of hardware, our suite, our computing platform, making sure that this is a safe robotaxi, we're number one. That's my takeaway.
Yeah.
And and
I,
and he's
I,
also
I don't want.
using this V2X
No, go.
solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
At certain
Yep.
intersections. So yeah,
That's
but
the V2X
you know,
was a bit peculiar as well because that's going to be kind of lumpy. The rollout is going to be city by city and kind of creating standards and things like that. Although I did see an article, I haven't read it yet, but I bookmarked it, that China is creating standards for connected vehicles. So maybe V2X is closer than we think, or at least around the corner from a mass adoption
but
standpoint here in China.
yeah, but I guess the other takeaway is really these. We also mentioned this probably earlier episodes. The China Fornia companies is going to be ahead of the pack, I think. You know, Baidu, obviously, their Apollo, their Robotaxi is huge. But these, you know, the AutoX, WeRide, and Pony, they are the ones to be reckoned with when it comes to commercialization of robotaxis.
Yeah, without
Seriously,
question.
I think that they're, yeah.
Well,
And by the way, Professor X, he studied in Hong Kong University of Science and Technology 16 years ago, and he went to Princeton and set up a kind of a, I think, some sort of autonomous technology lab. That's
right.
why he, you know, he's a professor. He taught there, I think, and I think he also went to MIT to study. So this is a very technical guy. And I was listening to one of his podcasts on ARK Invest. I mean, he just throws out all these technical jargons in English, like you know, it's ABC, you know, like it's one,
Sure.
two, three. And then when he talks in Chinese, I mean, he's very fluent, although with a bit of a, you know, local
Low, low accent.
accent. But this guy knows his stuff, I think. So,
Yeah, yeah. But I do have to believe there's a law of diminishing returns on the sensors. Number one, and then number two, and this is a bit more tongue in cheek. I don't want to be sitting next to that computer in the Pacifica, because that thing has to be running hot, and there has to be a ton of BTUs coming off of that
well,
thing.
they have their cooling system and wire harness. That's all part of their Gen 5
Yeah, yeah.
setup.
Again,
So right,
again.
so
But again,
yeah.
that's why it's a little peculiar that it's still an ICE that they're using. I understand that whole drive-by-wire thing, but I think it would save them a bit of a headache if they move to an electric vehicle platform. But
And interestingly, he also has this assembly shop in Changzhou. Changzhou is where Li Auto's plant is based.
and
So
yo
I don't
and
know how
Xiaoyo,
that works. Yeah, so where he assembles these Pacificas with the suite setup. So
yeah, but
yeah,
these Pacificas are assembled by hand. They're likely one-offs.
retrofitted.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, so I think this it's more of a prototype shop than probably some formal factory that
right.
churns
And
out these cars.
that's this type of retrofitted vehicle is entirely different than the Alpha S that we talked
Yeah.
about 2 episodes ago, right? Where you visited,
Yeah.
where it's dedicated robotaxis produced at BAIC's whatever production lines.
And
Same with the
and
red flag.
and that's
So
at least a clear indication that they're not as far along on that side of it than some of their
right, it's definitely not
competitors.
a 480,000 MMB robotaxi,
Sure.
right? Maybe multiplied by 2.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.